Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, and each week at this time, we bring you topics and discussions on the management matters that matter. Now, today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome as my special guest, Andrew Hill. Andrew Hill is an award-winning columnist. He's the associate editor and management editor of the Financial Times, writes weekly columns and longer pieces that I know many of you read. I certainly do. And also, of course, takes part in many, many podcasts and writes books as well. So welcome, Andrew. Delighted to see you here.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. So at CMI, we've recently done a major piece of work. It's not quite out yet. Talking to over 2,300 senior, middle, and junior managers about what really mattered to them with management and leadership in COVID. And we assumed that where you worked, so whether you were working in a super busy hospital on the front line or a grocery store where you had to be on site, or whether you were working in a booming tech company like Zoom 100% virtually, or maybe where you were working in a circumstance where you were sometimes in the office and sometimes at home, we really assumed that would make a big difference to people. And also the level of demand, whether their business was, or organization was booming or busting. But in fact, that really didn't make much of a difference at all. And I just wondered, did that surprise you?
It did surprise me. I think I would have made the same assumption that you made. I mean, often with what I'm writing about and talking to people about the future of the office or the workplace looms large, it's almost become synonymous with the future of work. And in fact, it suggests to me that perhaps we've downplayed somewhat the future of work as an experience, one mediated by the people we deal with more than the places where we do the work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. And because, what we found is it didn't really matter where you worked, to your point. What really mattered was how you worked. And in particular, how your organization was being managed and being led. And there were a couple of key observations. Most managers felt that their workforce had been more productive, but this was particularly true when the managers trusted their direct reports. So those people were especially productive. And the other thing they told us is managers, because we like to say, oh, who needs managers? Well, in this pandemic, we need managers. So the role of the manager, 85% said it's as or more important than ever before. So why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think there's your point about the people being more productive. I think that's unsurprising or less surprising than the first finding, partly because obviously as we went into this crisis and as we've been going through it, there was a great sort of adrenaline rush. People having to deal with a new situation. Change sometimes does get people sort of spurred out of their old habits. So to some degree, they both had to be more productive in lots of cases because lots of new things were happening. And they had the sort of inspiration of feeling, something's changing and it may be good, it may be bad, but I think I'm going to kind of have to rise to the challenge. So that finding was less surprising. There's interesting that your point about trust, or the point about trust is obviously very important here. I mean, I recently saw a Boston Consulting Group report that talked about or suggested that we were partly getting more productivity from teams because actually a lot of the sort of rubbish bits of management had fallen away. The admin, the bureaucracy, the useless meetings. There just simply wasn't time to organize those, and that some of them couldn't take place anyway. And in fact, that left the good things about work. Now, that in some respects sounds like it's not very flattering to the managers themselves, because it's kind of suggesting that was a layer of bureaucracy that could be taken out. And that, of course, is too often, I think, the view that people have of managers. But I actually think that what it means is that this element of trust, the role of managers shifting and changing so that actually the human qualities of management come out, have become more important. And I think, the productivity point is expressive, I think, in some places of the role of managers doing the right thing. I chaired a panel last week on this topic, and one of the panelists from Tata Consulting said that they'd found that their teams did better. They lost fewer people. The people that they kept were more engaged. They did better on project delivery when their managers touched in for individual check-ins with one-on-one with people in the team wherever they were working. And those teams where they simply did a sort of top-down, old-style group meeting performed less well. And so that's just one example, I think, of the way in which that sort of trust element can be reinforced by good managers.
So it's great that you raised that, because your example about Tata Teams is exactly what our report found, and your reference to the more human traits of managers, again, coincides brilliantly with our findings. So we asked people, okay, what are the managerial traits that matter most now? And it was all the human qualities. So top of the list was clear communication for 95%, followed by honesty, listening, clear direction, and motivating others. So, those were the things that were really going to matter heading into 2021, those very human things. Do you think that maybe that's changed? Maybe it was different before the pandemic? You've touched on, maybe you think that has played a role.
I'm a strong believer that some of these things, all of these things that you've mentioned, are things that leaders should have been doing before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit strange, I suppose, to say, it took a global crisis of unparalleled magnitude to make people suddenly realize that the things you've mentioned are important in managers. I mean, I've just written a column that comes out on Monday where I've managed to boil them down into sort of 4 C's based on people I've been speaking to in the last couple of weeks, some of which overlap: clarity, connection and connectedness, collaboration, and I know we'll get to compassion. These seem things that managers should be encouraging and taking as the way in which they run their teams. But they were the same things that they ought to have been doing before. And again, perhaps the paraphernalia of management got in the way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And, we've had to sort of just focus on the essentials. And clearly, one of those major essentials now, because we ask people what's, the most important role of the manager, and 3/4 said well-being. Okay, so well-being, what perhaps would have been a peripheral nicety pre-pandemic, has suddenly emerged as the top priority for most of those we surveyed. Is this a blip because of the pandemic, or do you think it'll stay with us after we've learned to live with, or indeed vanquish, the virus?
Well, I hope it's not a blip. And one reason I think it won't be is that I think the trajectory of most organizations was towards improvements in well-being support. And, we've started to see the stigma being removed from mental illness, for example, at work. People had, usually through their people teams and HR teams, introduced support measures, including employee assistant programs, mental health first aid, and other well-being apps and online supports. And a lot of those have come into their own and indeed been expanded during the crisis. I think one point to make is that this isn't specifically and ought not to be a uniquely HR issue. I think probably some senior managers had sort of said, well, we'll ship this off to the people managers and they can do the managing of the people. Well, what we've already talked about, what's already clear is that the people managers are the managers. That is what managers are. So they also need to be taking on this together with the complex other things that managers have to do. They need to be taking on this well-being responsibility and indeed potentially, I think, expanding it. I think one thing that we've definitely seen and everybody has remarked on is that clearly, because a lot of us are communicating virtually from our homes, you can almost literally see what is behind us, family coming into the picture, where are we working from? It's become a topic of conversation. a sort of conversation starter, even at quite formal meetings. And all that suggests to me that clever and empathetic managers ought to be recognizing that there are people and communities behind their staff. And when the staff are unhappy, often it's to do with that. And so they maybe have some responsibility for extending some of these programs so that they cover family members and others if they don't already do so. I mean, I should say at this point, you know, it's nice of you to interview me, but I don't manage anyone. Anybody out there who is managing has my utmost respect for the complex job that they're doing. So, you know, perhaps there are a lot of people out there groaning at the idea that they have to take on this extra responsibility. But I do think it's important, and I do think it will survive the pandemic.
So I think it's a great point. And by the way, you can't see my background because I use this screen to hide the mess that's behind me. But yours looks lovely. And, you know, you made the point about the line manager's role in managing the people, which, you know, at CMI, that's why we exist, is to make people better line managers. And we often talk about culture, you know, the old quote about culture eating strategy for breakfast, or the culture of an organization being an incredibly important driver for employee engagement and ultimately for productivity. And what we found in this study was that the managers that did embrace those human practices, the people management experiences of really embracing flexible working, communicating and checking in often with their teams, creating a sense of belonging and doing initiatives that brought people together and taking the time to do that. The organizations that did that well, their managers were saying, our culture has definitely improved during this pandemic. And of course, their employees were more engaged, whereas the organizations that didn't do that as often, you know, maybe did it, 19 or 12% said they did these things, their cultures were getting worse and their people were less engaged. So that's kind of proving your point in a way. I mean, does that surprise you?
No, I think that's interesting, and clearly, again, it's something that should have been applied before the pandemic hit. I mean, I've been very interested from the outset of this crisis in what happens to corporate culture if we are mostly remote, or many of us are outside the office, which again loomed large as an idea of the place where culture is created. And I think actually I'm becoming more optimistic about this. I did halfway through lockdown and in midsummer probably felt to myself that actually culture was going to disintegrate. It was going to be hard to maintain that. And actually I'm picking up from people I speak to that in some ways the tools that we've now got are much more useful for creating new cultures and finding ways to evolve culture rapidly in a good way. But clearly that involves effort and time, as management always has. And therefore you have to be able to find ways to improve the culture and shape the culture as you go along. And if you neglect it, it will potentially wither away because it doesn't even have the physical workplace to support it in the same way that it perhaps used to. So I think these are, questions that have come to the fore during the crisis, but they aren't necessarily new questions. One thing that I think is interesting is that we've all, I think, experienced moments where we've thought to ourselves, why am I doing this thing? Why am I sitting in front of this screen, bashing this keyboard again, or in these endless Zoom meetings? So I think it has raised a sort of rather profound philosophical question about what work means to people and how you find fulfillment through work. It certainly has for me. And that's something where managers, I think, have a role, team leaders have a role in being able to keep people fulfilled in the work they do and not allow them to become, hamsters on a wheel, which is a metaphor that I've heard many, many times over the last 6 months. So that's another area of culture that needs attention, particular attention during this crisis.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And by the way, we are going to take questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box and we will get to it later on in the broadcast. Now, one thing did stay the same, which maybe won't surprise you, it doesn't surprise me, is that the senior leaders thought they were doing a much better job of all of this than the people that worked for them. And, we've seen that pre-pandemic. So senior leaders do tend to have slightly more rose-tinted glasses to just how motivated their direct reports are. But what really is important is where these behaviors are practiced, the cultures are better. So, senior leaders really should be the role models. Have you, if you interview a lot of senior leaders, do you think they get that? Or, do you think they just want to kind of get through this and restore the factory settings?
I think I think there is some recognition that things have changed and they need to acknowledge things. I've talked to a few leaders who were avowed skeptics about remote working, for example, and who have been brought round to the idea that it presents an opportunity for them as much as the challenge. Somebody pointed out to me the other day something I hadn't really thought of before, which was that obviously senior leaders in some respects feel like they've been managing remotely for a while, because if you work for a company of any size or any regional distribution, you're probably sitting in an office and dealing with people remotely on the other side of the world or just at the other end of the country most of the time. So I think actually it's presenting more of a challenge to the more junior leaders in the groups that I've spoken to, because they are the ones who had got used to the idea of being able to manage by walking around, picking up, as somebody said to me last week, the kind of having the ambient awareness of being in an office with somebody who's not doing well or isn't happy or is looking for help and assistance. And that's clearly much harder to achieve when you have to check in with people virtually and can't see them or hear them all day long. So I think there are differences in the way in which senior leaders and junior leaders are experiencing this. And perhaps it's more difficult for those who are less experienced. And the senior leaders clearly need to also understand that, because if they lose their junior managers, either to stress or worry, then they too are going to find themselves, slightly marooned at the top.
Yeah, it's a great point. And talking about junior leaders, I want to touch on, there's been 3 marginalized groups in this crisis, and we did look at how each of them felt. And picking up on your junior leader point, Gen Z, we always talked about Gen Z as the purpose loomed large for these folks before the pandemic. They wanted to work for somewhere that had a purpose and was meaningful. Now they're just plain worried about job security. That was their number one concern. Job security, well-being, safety, support, and being kept in the loop. What are your thoughts about how we can mitigate the impact of this crisis on this future generation of leaders?
Well, I think that is tough. I mean, of course, that group has also had the practical difficulty, although your survey didn't demonstrate that where they worked was an issue. We've all heard, those of us who are reasonably comfortably established in homes with gardens or with a bit more space to move around, have to bear in mind that not only the younger members of the workforce, but also plenty of those in other countries which don't have the same amount of space to work in are, suffering through lockdowns because they don't have the access to the outdoor space or the ability to kind of make the most of it. And that, I think, has hit the younger generation probably harder than older and better established workers. I think on the purpose job security point, actually, interestingly, before the pandemic, I wrote a few pieces over the years about generational difference, pointing out what all the surveys suggest, that people want purpose and meaning at work, and particularly the younger generation are looking for some world-changing aspect to their job in search of fulfillment. And almost always, I did get some pushback from Gen Z or younger workers saying, actually, a lot of this is just about, please give us a job that is secure. So this has really just exacerbated that underlying sense among some of that generation that, okay, yes, it'd be great to have a job that is going to change the world and make me feel like I'm contributing to wider society and so on. But I really want something that is secure and that is going to kind of keep me going. And, this particular point, you would grab at that opportunity, I think, over probably the nice to have, I think indispensable, but for lots of people, nice to have idea of positive purpose and world changing fulfillment.
Yeah, it is obviously a very important point. I'm reminded about being on a panel about generation rent. They just actually want to be able to pay the rent. So your point is well made. Okay, they do miss the office. The younger people miss the office most, but the number one thing people missed, and this is the last question before I open it out, is the fraternization with their colleagues, and the ability of building networks, having those informal moments, and actually even the events that you do with your colleagues or the social interactions. What they miss least is the workplace perks like the gyms and the fancy eateries. Back to the future of the office, its role in design. How do you think that's going to change post-COVID?
Well, again, this is an idea that was put into my head the other day when I was talking about this subject for an Indian conference, actually, where the idea was expressed that maybe the office now is less important than the hardware, and that has a kind of equalizing effect, because it means that the multinational that used to be the one that could afford to have a wonderful office space in which to work and with all those perks is actually on the same footing as a small company that can still provide the best laptop, pay for your broadband, send you a camera that allows you to do your Zoom calls, and all those kind of individual office perks become more important. So I thought that was an interesting point. Against that, what I would say is, clearly, particularly in some countries, India being a good example, the office was a haven from work for some of the workers. It was often the reason why you would choose to work for a big company. And so it still has value in some corporate cultures more than others. And the other point is, and this was something that Nick Bloom at Stanford, who's done some of the work on remote and physical working and the options and how it affects productivity, made to me. He thought that some of the productivity improvements that big companies had seen were actually down to the fact that they had a better management structure. They had an HR department that could roll out the support measures that we were talking about earlier, and that were able to provide backup, allowing the operational managers to go about their day-to-day with the correct support. And so, again, coming back to our initial discussion, I think those human qualities that can be offered have emerged very strongly as the ones that managers should be playing up. And the perks, perhaps this should always have been the case, the ping pong table and the billiard table and the nice canteen food and something turn out to be just nice to have elements of management and the workplace.
Yeah, which is, a nice overall arching conclusion, being human and the human aspects of management still ultimately matter the most. Yeah. I'm going to take some questions now. Our first question is from Tracy and Bryn, who are discussing this in the LinkedIn chat as we speak. Yes. Line managers need emotional intelligence to function in the way being described. Any thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, I think that is clearly what we've been describing. Linda Grattan from London Business School told me early on in this crisis, when we were talking about this, that she thought that some, frankly, unempathetic leaders might have a crash course in emotional intelligence through this, and indeed discover that they had to kind of acquire these skills in order to manage effectively. We'll wait and see whether that turns out to be the case. But I think actually even some quite straight-laced managers have found that they've been joining some of these Zoom calls and having to share more than they might previously have shared, and touch in on some of their own vulnerability, because although it's had an unequal effect depending on where you are and who you are and what health vulnerabilities you have, everyone has been affected. And that's perhaps given managers a way to express emotional intelligence that they may not have had before or thought of using.
Yeah, it's a really good point and well observed. The next question is from Patrick. How can managers build high levels of trust when face-to-face interaction with all that it brings, including body language and side conversations, isn't possible?
Yeah, well, that's one for the psychologists probably, but I think this is a challenge, and clearly it's a challenge that can only be developed, which we'll only be able to answer actually when we get further through the long period of hybrid or virtual remote working. I think obviously insofar as rules allow it, the ability to get together when you can get together and for the right reasons will become more and more important. So, the creative meetings that I enjoy with colleagues, we've been trying to have in outdoor spaces occasionally to be able to just chat and talk about ideas. That might not be as important when I'm writing a column or working on some long piece of journalism. And there'll be analogies in every industry for that. So I think it's a question of finding the opportunities to build that trust through a face-to-face meeting when it's possible. When it's impossible, as it is currently in the UK for a lot of people, then I think you have to use the tools that you've got. And I go back to this frequent checking in one-on-one with colleagues. These are things that do take time, but as various managers have told me, once you start doing it, you don't need to check in for very long. I mean, you can ask, how are you? Is there anything I can do for you? Which seem to be two critical management questions these days, and indeed before the pandemic. You can do that, and the answer may be simply, I'm fine, I'm working on this, I don't need anything extra at the moment, see you next week. But that does help build trust, I think, even with managers who are new to roles, which of course we're beginning to see people taking on roles in the pandemic who've never met their team in person.
Absolutely, and those who have onboarded virtually. So the next question is from Ellie, and it actually builds on the previous question. And I do have a tip there. At CMI, we also did some outdoor picnics. But her question is, do senior managers have a duty to check in with those who are not necessarily their direct reports to ensure that line management is working well for all staff? Great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I'm not sure I would quite put it as a duty. I think it's an advantage of the immediate flattening of hierarchy that we've seen, is that you can check in with others. And clearly there are ways to do that that seem creepy and slightly kind of reaching down past another layer of management. And there are ways to do it that simply amount to more of these check-ins that I've been describing and that do build trust. I mean, I think there's always been a duty for some face-to-face interaction between a senior manager and the front line of staff, and that need not be seen as cutting out the middle manager or the junior manager who might be the team leader in that group. And so I do think that's more important. It loads on more time, but I think it's becoming something that you can do arguably more easily using the virtual tools that we've got.
Absolutely. And what I've done at CMI is get groups of 6 together from across the organization that wouldn't otherwise know each other necessarily, so different levels and departments, in a virtual chat, and ask them all the same question, which is, what makes you mad? What makes you sad? What makes you glad? And you just go around and everybody shares that. And by the end of that half hour, people feel much more connected. So that would be my tip for how you can check in virtually, Ellie, and make sure that your staff feel connected. It worked really well. So a question here from Tamer. What are the most important duties for managers of teams during the pandemic, given that many studies have show that people have been depressed, have faced depression during this pandemic?
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether that question applies to managers or staff, but clearly both are in that same place under pressure. I mean, the advice is often, and I think the good advice is, manage energy levels. So that is to do with the energy levels of your team. Are they flagging? Can you start to say to them, look, let's leave this till tomorrow. Let's do this another day. a number of companies, my colleague Polita Clark has written about this, have been offering days off and saying, right, nobody's going to do anything, or short of that, we're not going to have any meetings on a Friday or a Monday or wherever you want to put it in the week. But of course, a critical part of that is also self-management, managing your own energy as a manager to avoid becoming that kind of burnt out husk. And, I'm writing something about HR teams at the moment. And one of the questions I'm asking them is, clearly they've been under vast pressure. How are they actually trying to run their own energy levels to avoid being suddenly the ones who collapse because they've been offering too much support or spent too much time offering support to others?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we did. I saw that article from Polita, and we did do a mental health day at CMI, right? So days are getting darker. Everybody take the day off. I think it's a great thing to do. So last question. It's a good one from Kay. So Andrew, what's the most innovative management practice you've seen in recent months?
Well, I'm dependent on people telling me about innovative management practices, so they may be exaggerating the effectiveness of that. Early on, and I don't know whether I'd even call this a management practice, but early on, I interviewed Kevin Sneeder, the senior partner of McKinsey, who talked, to my surprise, I don't know him well, but I had met him before, but he was one of the first ones to talk about how he had pitched in and joined a pet day for his staff in showing off their pets online, which was something they were already doing before the crisis. And he'd gone on, I think he said he was a cat person, got on with his cat. And now I thought, maybe not innovative, it's happened before, people have done it within small teams and so on, but the fact that the top guy was prepared to pitch in and show that side of himself in the early days of the crisis, I thought was pretty interesting. And an innovative way to handle things when people were probably feeling a little bit kind of bruised by the early days of the crisis.
Yeah, it's a great observation. So many people have gotten puppies during this pandemic, right? And pets are wonderful companions, cats and dogs, that help with actually the depression point. Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed this discussion, and stay well. And I hope you'll go do something nice now, perhaps with a pet or a family member.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Good luck, everyone.
See you next week. And if you enjoyed this chat and want to join the CMI community, please click in the chat box. Thank you all, and see you next week. Take care.